Being a mortician is an easy job, or at least one would think so. For me, it's always been, for lack of a better term, peaceful. Sure, it can get a bit gross from time to time, but at the end of the day, there's no one I really need to answer to aside from the family members of the deceased, and they never see what goes on my table, so little things here and there tend to go unnoticed. A little puncture wound here, a slice hidden by clothing there, things like that. My job, most of the time, is to pretty up the deceased and give the family a better last impression than that of a bloated corpse. Don't let this lead you to believe that I'm some hack gladly taking money to carelessly tend to bodies before they're buried. I haven't been in this long, but I am a professional. Not many people can say they've pieced together a victim from a head-on collision with a semi and pulled off an open casket. What I'm trying to say is, don't get the wrong idea about me. People come to me because they know I can do the job and do it well. Luckily for me, I'm not the one dealing with the clientele most of the time. I leave that to the receptionists. This is an easy job, as I said. Or at least, it was. See, when I first started doing this half a decade ago, I was younger and therefore a tad more inexperienced. Nervous, even. Not that I was afraid of a dead body, mind you. Not even close. It was more that I had something to prove. The one whose place I ended up taking took me under his wing when he had little reason to. Some kid comes in off the street, and the first interview question is, "How are you with gore?" 20 minutes later, and I was in the basement learning how to drain the blood from a body and fill it with embalming fluid. Exciting day that was. My predecessor, let's call him Peter, made light of grim work. He was a guy in his late 30s, a good 20 years older than me nearly. He was stocky, didn't seem to see the sun much, and liked to keep a bottle of whiskey cleverly hidden among the various bottles of fluids we used for work. I never saw the thing full, but I also never saw it empty either. He made it a point to make sure I wasn't tense and was comfortable with the work. He made it pretty clear early in that while the job would be a bit messy at times, the majority of my time in that basement would be spent alone. Just me and whatever corpse I was working on that day. He showed me all the tricks he used to keep from losing his marbles down there. Listening to music was the most common, but as anyone that works long hours can tell you, you'd be surprised how quickly you go through a 1,000-song library, and how often songs repeat. Sometimes, working in silence was a nice reprieve. It would allow you to focus on the task at hand and clear one's mind of all the bullshit from the day. The most disconcerting of which, or hilarious, depending on your darkness of humor, was talking to the bodies. It could have been about anything, and I would see him talk to the corpses about it at one point or another. One of his favorite things to do was talk about current events, often joking how they were lucky that they didn't need to deal with shit like that anymore. Even when I wasn't around, and he was working alone, I could hear him talking to them every now and then when I would come down the stairs to the basement to start helping him for the day. He took it the whole 9 yards, even going so far as to have little pauses in his one-way dialogue, as if giving them a chance to answer. Of course, he would never catch me doing it. I refused to do it simply because I thought it was weird. Only crazy people talk to things that don't talk back, right? Eventually, after a period of 1.5 years, Peter ended up moving away, telling management that he had trained me in everything I would need to know for the job, and that I was fully capable of dealing with bodies on my own now. I won't lie, I was a little surprised to see him go. I never heard from him after that last day we worked together. He genuinely seemed to enjoy the work, morbid as it was, and I'd like to think he at least tolerated me despite not feeding into his admittedly creepy way of coping with long shifts. I had hoped he was just leaving for some much-needed extended vacation, But when he came to me to say his goodbyes, I knew something was wrong. "Well, kid," he started, "it's been fun, but I think you're old enough to dress a body without my help now." This confused me at first. I thought he was joking. "Hey, come on, man. What are you talking about?" He looked saddened by this. As creepy as he could be, he was at least easy to work with. I didn't want to see him go. "I've got some stuff I need to take care of back home. Just got a call from some family up north and they need me to see to some funeral arrangements." I could tell by the tone in his voice that he wasn't entirely lying, though about which part, I couldn't be sure. "Oh. Well, I mean, you do what you have to, right? When will you be back?" "Not sure I can keep the body count managed by myself," I laughed, trying to lighten the mood a little. "Well, I'm not sure really. I shouldn't be more than a couple of weeks." His reassurance didn't, reassure me very much. I could tell something was wrong, though I didn't press the issue. We shook hands. He gave me a pat on the shoulder, gathered a few personal things from around the room, and headed for the stairs. "You'll do good, don't worry," he said. Before he walked out of sight, he looked over his shoulder and back at me. "Oh, and I left my stuff behind the tubs of makeup powder in the cabinet by the back wall. Had to move it. Bosses didn't like when they found it a few days ago. Help yourself to it. You may need it." With that, he gave me a half-hearted grin and walked up the stairs and out of sight. I never saw him again. At the time, I was still under the impression that he would eventually be back, at least partially. But there was work to be done, and the constant slew of bodies ending up on my table showed no signs of slowing down anytime soon. An hour later, I was opening up the elevator to wheel in a recently deceased elderly woman. She seemed to have gone peacefully, her file stating that she died in her sleep. She wouldn't need much work, thankfully. I got to work, setting about getting her on the table, tending to any residual bowel voiding, and getting her blood drained. If anything, the latter gave me a chance to relax on the job. You don't realize just how much blood is in a person until all that blood is, outside of it. This would be my first time truly alone with the body I was working on. I quickly realized just how quiet it was without Peter to at least chat with. The sound of the embalming siphon whirring away, the only sound filling the air. I thought to myself, what could it hurt? I looked over her file once more. 86, huh? It's a long time. I'm sure you've got some stories to tell. I felt ridiculous. Even as I looked at her, unmoving as she was. I paused for a moment, considering this, as if she were going to answer. "Well, Mrs. Moore, you don't need to worry about much at this point, I suppose. Gonna get you looking pretty so we can give you a proper send-off." I hadn't realized just how lowly I was talking, as if one of the higher-ups was going to come down those stairs and look at me like I was insane, or worse, as if someone were in earshot. I turned around to switch out my gloves, as they were already covered in various bodily fluids, when I heard it. "Thank you." It was so quiet. So quiet, I thought I was imagining things. It was softer than a whisper, softer than any sound I'd ever heard. I barely made it out over the sound of the embalming siphon ending its cycle. It was silent now. The only sound that broke the quiet was the sound of my disposed gloves hitting the trash. I had to be hearing things, I told myself. Bodies don't fucking talk. They're dead. I turned back to see the elderly woman, in exactly the same place as I'd left her. She hadn't moved an inch, not a hair out of place. Needless to say, I hurried along with the job. I pulled the various tubes from her body, making sure to keep my work neat as I went. A few days later, she was buried. The family got their closure, and were just glad she didn't go a worse way. I was glad to have her off my table. Several days later, after dealing with the menial paperwork that comes with the bodies, a new corpse graced my table. By then, I was over the strange occurrence of hearing what I could only assume was that old woman answering me. That didn't last long. The body I would be working on for the next 3 days was a murder victim, male, late 20s. He was only a couple years older than myself. He'd been stabbed over 20 times, though by who was yet to be determined. They'd sent him fresh from a medical examiner's office, so a fair bit of the work was already done for me. The hard part was going to be making his wounds look less gruesome. The mother was insistent on an open casket. Grief does strange things to people. Now, I've had to deal with some rough work, but this was fairly early on in my career. Stitching up a living body is one thing. Those heal and scar up. It's another thing entirely to stitch up a body that's stiff and cold, and make it look like nothing ever happened. Modern science has given us morticians wonderful things like flesh-adhesive putty and very accurate cauterizers. I was tending to the 6th of many puncture wounds, turning around to grab a new spool of thread and a container of flesh putty, remarking to myself, "Man, and I thought I'd pissed off my girlfriend before." Not her. I heard it, just as I shut the old metal cabinet doors, the kind that creak ever so slightly. I nearly dropped what I was holding. It was that same kind of whisper, so soft as to be inaudible even on its own, yet perfectly clear. "Okay, what the fuck?" I uttered, slowly turning back to face the young man on my table. He lay there, motionless and full of holes, just as I left him not a few seconds earlier. I walked back up to the table, picking up a pair of forceps, not hesitating in poking the young man's face. As was to be expected, there was no twitch, no sudden jump off the table. I was poking the face of a dead man like a child poking a dead animal, all because I thought I heard a voice. I had no way of knowing where it came from, and my brain seemed to think the only logical conclusion was, "Hey, you see that dead guy on the table? It came from him." I hesitantly put the forceps back on the table, blinking in slight confusion. Once is an overactive imagination, but twice, I whispered to myself. I shook the thought away, resuming my work. Those stab wounds weren't going to stitch and putty themselves. While I went about my business, tending to a particularly large gash along the young man's thigh, I heard it once more. "Best friend lied." The sound was enough to make my blood run cold. My eyes darted up to the corpse's mouth milliseconds after that last word. He was still as ever. Needless to say, I kept an eye on him for the remainder of his time on my table. His funeral was certainly an interesting one, or at least, that's what I heard. There was tension among the grieving, especially between the deceased's girlfriend and his parents, who brought her new boyfriend along. The eulogy was strained, the reception was awkward. It was a mess. One of the receptionists later told me that the girlfriend had one of her seedier friends take the young man out of the picture. Of course, there was no way of really confirming this. But by that point, I was past caring. I had done my job, and a new corpse was on my table by then. The newest arrival, I recognized. She was one of my childhood friends. Her name was Rachel. When we all graduated high school, many of us left the town we lived in. She was one of the few who didn't, along with myself and what I can only assume were a few others. She had been in a pretty gruesome car accident. She was brought in a few pieces, but it was nothing that couldn't be managed. A lot of work, but it could be managed. When the body bags came down in the elevator, I recognized her immediately, even with all the damage. We hadn't been close, but when we were much younger, I'd had a huge crush on her. She was too pretty for this world, too innocent, even into adulthood. I hadn't failed my mentor yet. He taught me well, and there wasn't a body that had graced my table that I hadn't been able to put back together well enough to show in an open casket. I wasn't about to start now. Of course, I was still under the impression that he was coming back. I got her pieces laid out on the table, wheeling a cart next to it, beginning to load it up with the tools I'd be needing. It was going to be quite the task. Shame we had to meet again like this, I said mournfully. I was talking to the corpses out of some strange habit now. Maybe Peter was right in that it certainly helped the time pass, broke the silence, and kept me from listening to another metal album for the 20th time in a week. I looked to her pieces expectantly, as if awaiting an answer. Been so long and you have nothing to say, I joked, scoffing at my own awful sense of humor, turning to the cart to clean a few of my tools.
Where am I?
A soft voice asked, softer than a whisper, barely audible through the clinking of small metal tools. I turned to look her in the face. I knew by now that I wasn't just hearing things. Something wasn't right. I couldn't have been losing my mind. You're in a mortuary, Rach. You had a little accident recently. I stopped, wondering just why the hell I was answering a corpse. A corpse who had no business asking questions or doing much of anything at all, for that matter. It was different this time, though. This girl was my friend. Whether it was just me regretting lost time or her spirit hanging around her body, or something else I can't even fathom, I wasn't just going to leave her question hanging. She didn't answer. Of course, this wasn't a surprise, but I noticed a pattern. The corpses gracing my table never seemed to talk if you were looking right at them. I turned back to my tools, making sure I had everything I needed before beginning the arduous task of putting her back together.
Where's my leg? My arm?
I didn't turn back to her this time. They're right here, don't worry. I'm gonna get you put back together, nice and easy. Your family won't want to see you like this. I figured I was past the point of questioning this. If anything, I was starting to see why Peter made such a show of talking to the bodies. Some things were starting to make a bit more sense. I wheeled the cart up, setting about reattaching her leg to her torso. I never looked her in the face if I could help it. Instead, focusing on the task.
It's so dark here.
That one little utterance made my blood run colder than anything else thus far. I looked up at one of the high windows on the basement wall. It was the middle of the day, the sun shining brightly into the room.
It's so cold here. Where am I?
The whisperings creeping above the sounds of flesh binding to flesh once more unnerved me. I didn't want to know what she was talking about, but the sound was still there. My hand slipped while stitching her back up more than once. Tiny puncture wounds lined her hip and backside, many out of place. I thought I could block it out, but something about a childhood friend being on my table, being confused as to where she was, and to top it off, dead. It wasn't something I could handle, apparently. The last thing I heard her say was,
So dark. So alone.
I jammed earbuds in my ears after that. At the end of my shift, I put her back in the freezer. I'd have to continue the next day, and the next 2 after that. Coming back the next morning, I made sure to keep my music blaring, so much so that it killed my battery, and I had to stop and charge it while I was out to lunch. I kept a towel over her face until I had to pretty her up once she was all put back together. Looking back, some of the best work I'd ever done was on her. Her funeral was one of the only ones I ever attended. It felt wrong to not send her off despite not having any contact with her for several years. As they shut the casket, I heard that faint little whisper.
I hear others.
It's been several years since then. Every now and then, I talk to the bodies, but not like Peter. It's usually, you've been in an accident or you didn't make it. For a little while, I tried being gentle with it, but a few of them were quite talkative, claiming that if I could hear them, maybe there was something I could do. There never was. After they buried Rachel, I had the next few days off. The owners of the mortuary knew I worked hard. They thought I deserved some time to grieve a friend. I'd gone back to my workspace to grab a couple things, when I found something. Ever since, whenever a body ends up on my table, I pull out Peter's stuff. It was in that fancy, large decanter, 2 shot glasses by its side, by the makeup powder, just where he said he'd left it. It looked like he thought I would join him at some point. I can't fault him for that. It's never quite full, but never empty. If I ever see him again, I'm not sure if I should thank him or punch him in the throat. I've got a new body coming onto my table today. Some poor guy was apparently poisoned from what they tell me. Hoping it was nothing caustic. I reached back in the cosmetics cabinet, grabbing the decanter and one of the shot glasses. Time to get to work.